Welcome to a new instalment of the pharmaphorum podcast. In a highly interesting conversation, I had the pleasure of speaking with Freya Biosciences co-founder and chief scientific officer, Johan van Hylckama Vlieg, about the role of the vaginal microbiome in fertility. Recorded during Women's History Month, Freya Biosciences had recently announced a $38 million Series A raise, one of the largest Series A raises to advance women's reproductive immunotherapies. After all, developments in women's health are ever and as yet lagging, leaving a considerable gap. As I say, it's a fascinating discussion and one which expands beyond the bounds of the oft spoken about gut microbiome, really centering the conversation in female biology, in the future of fertility. When it comes to life sciences at large, though, Vlieg expects that it will be inflammation as focus that will unveil the vaginal microbiome as a therapeutic target, only increasing in importance and pathways. And that future is bright, is exciting, and one which potentially will close the gap. As ever, let us know your thoughts, and thank you for listening. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Johan van Hylckama Vlieg, co-founder and chief scientific officer of Freya Biosciences, a Series A financed clinical stage microbial immunotherapy company in women's health. Today, Johan and I will be discussing the microbiome and fertility. As societies have modernized, fertility rates have declined substantially. According to Our World in Data, in the pre-modern era, fertility rates of 4.5 to 7 children per woman were common. At that time, very high levels of infant and child mortality kept population growth low. As health and mortality outlooks have improved, though, the global average fertility rate has halved from around 5 in the 1960s to around 2.4 by 2021. There are perhaps 3 key reasons for this: the empowerment of women, that is, education and participating in the labour market, as well as declining child mortality rates and the rising cost of raising children. As a consequence, the global population growth rate has declined to less than 1% per year today. However, the question is, and certainly the question being addressed today in this podcast is there another, more biologically based reason for this decline? The vaginal microbiome is an intricate and dynamic microecosystem that constantly undergoes fluctuations during the female menstrual cycle, sex, childbirth, the menopause, basically a woman's entire life. Many people think of the term vaginal microbiome as chiefly referring to the vagina's bacterial environment, which includes more than 300 bacteria species, according to a 2020 study published in the journal Nature Communications. However, the microbiome also includes non-bacterial organisms in the vagina, such as yeasts, as well as viruses. In many people with healthy vaginal microbiota, bacteria called lactobacillus dominate the vagina. Lactobacillus is a bacterial genus that includes many different species, and a vaginal microbiome dominated by lactobacillus is thought to be optimal, according to a 2021 review article published in Frontiers in Cellular and Infection Microbiology, often associated with decreased risk of a variety of negative health outcomes. So it is that Freya Biosciences recently announced a $38 million Series A raise, one of the largest Series A raises to advance women's reproductive immunotherapies. Indeed, Freya's clinical pipeline is focused on furthering the clinical development of its lead drug candidate, an investigational vaginal microbial immunotherapeutic for the treatment of infertility in women with dysbiotic vaginal microbiota who are undergoing assisted reproductive technology, or ART. with Johan having recently presented at the Microbiome movement in Barcelona, speaking about the microbiome in women's health and fertility, and this being Women's History Month, it seemed appropriate to have him on the podcast. So before we get into our main topic of conversation, Johan, perhaps you could tell listeners a little about your journey to doing what you do today with Freya Biosciences.
Absolutely, Nicole. I'm happy to do that. So I am a microbiologist by training and have worked over 25 years in areas using microbes for health applications. Initially, very much looking at the interaction with food and the gut microbiome and how that impacts different health outcomes in metabolic health and also in inflammatory conditions. And over the years, I become more and more intrigued about the strong impact that microbes have, especially on immune function in our body. And at the same time, as science progressed and we understood better and better how microbes impact immune function, the whole area of using microbes as drugs also flourished. And the last 10 years or so, most of my activities actually focusing on developing microbes as drugs or targeting the microbiome with small molecules to improve health outcomes. And then maybe it's also interesting to highlight that I think most people have heard about microbiome research, and a lot of focus is always on the gut microbiome, how the gut microbiome can be targeted to, for instance, impact inflammatory bowel disease. And what I think is striking if you look at this, despite the fact that there's a lot of advancements in therapeutics, we actually have 2 drugs on the market nowadays. For many indications, even though there's a strong evidence of a role of the microbiome, it still is hard to precisely define the therapeutic target. Which microbe do I really need to change in large parts of the population to have a beneficial outcome? And from a scientific perspective, what always struck me is that most of the efforts are focusing on the gut microbiome. Very little attention is actually paid to the vaginal microbiome. And scientifically, it is a less complex target, right? Essentially, as you already said in your introduction, at the highest level, the vaginal microbiome exists in 2 conditions. One is lactobacillus dominated. You typically have a low diversity microbiome. There's a few species and a relatively low number of different strains in there, and it associates with a low pH, low inflammatory conditions. And cross-sectional studies have also shown that it is correlated to lower risk of developing infections, sexually transmitted disease, but also strongly associates with reproductive health outcomes, such as lower risk of preterm birth, but also a higher chance to get pregnant. Now, the other condition in which the vaginal microbiome exists is actually a dysbiotic condition, and that is characterized by the dominance of many often anaerobic microbes, a higher biomass, so there's more bacteria in there. And in some cases, this is symptomatic, and this is bacterial vaginosis in many cases. But in many women, it is actually not symptomatic. And that's one of the areas that we as a company have focused a lot on. And I can tell a little bit more about that if that's what would interest you.
Thank you. So a lot of information there, Johan. I want to unpack some of it. As you mentioned, the very word microbiome, most people go towards the gut microbiome. What's interesting there, as you said, that's actually more complex than the vaginal microbiome, and you've gone into details there. But I just want to stick with this perhaps bias towards going straight to gut microbiome thinking. It's probably fair to say that the needs of women's health are largely unmet across the board. So I was just wondering if you were able to comment on the poor state of women's health being addressed at the moment, today, even today, I might say, because after all, this expression that keeps being repeated when it comes to drug development for women is we are not just small men.
No, I think this is so well stated. And, so that it's definitely true. And there's many points of evidence over and over again that the amount of investment and attention that there is for women's health diseases is just massively, it's underfunded essentially, and it's underinvestigated. But I also do see a change. There is a lot more and more excitement in the field that this is needed from a societal perspective. But actually, and I think this really helps, there's also a real investment and a business opportunity here as well. So more and more excitement. There are a few major pharma players that are really focusing on this. Very interesting. Also, the venture capital community, the investors are paying more and more attention. And of course, that also thrives to both academic groups, but also small biotechs to really start to innovate in this area. And I think what is also very indicative for the change of the tides in this area is that, for instance, the White House recently announced an initiative that they really want to fund with substantial money research in women's health. So that whole ecosystem is changing. Now, I think that's the good news, and we see lots of activities. What is also striking is that many of the innovative approaches are focusing on improving the interaction of a woman with her healthcare provider, right? So there's many apps, advice, helping women to have that journey in their disease or in their specific women's health questions. And of course, that's important. And I think it's massively benefiting women. But what is still very much underinvested and where there's still limited innovation is actually developing new drugs, specific drugs for women's health indications. There's very few activities here, and many assets are still very early stage. So I think we as a community really need to get our joint forces and advance this area. And this is where I think Freya, with its microbial immunotherapies, is really well positioned.
Absolutely. As you say, it's one thing providing something that permits a woman greater discourse and agency when it comes to her own health, but it's another to have tangible therapeutics or drugs available to address the needs unmet as yet. So let's now go to the core of our conversation today, which is vaginal microbiota and fertility. A study last year in the Nature Scientific Reports journal explored how vaginal microbiota contribute to a woman's reproductive and general health. And it found that the composition of the vaginal microbiota changes and takes on added importance during pregnancy, serving as a barrier against infection for both mother and fetus. Despite the importance of the microorganisms that colonize the vagina, details of how changes in composition and diversity can impact pregnancy outcomes is as yet poorly understood. And female reproductive microbiota have also been suggested to affect infertility and may play a key role in the success of assisted reproductive technologies mentioned earlier, those ARTs, such as embryo implantation and pregnancy care. And since the first IVF baby was born in 1978, ARTs have become safer, more successful, and more accessible. So, all this given, I was wondering if, firstly, you could explain the role of vaginal microbiota in pregnancy.
Yes, absolutely. So you already alluded to some of the studies out there. And I think the most convincing evidence, supported by multiple studies of where the vaginal microbiome really impacts pregnancy outcomes, are one in the area of getting pregnant, right? So there's at least 7 or 8 studies that look specifically at in vitro fertilization and trying to correlate the vaginal microbiome and also the endometrial microbiome to the chance of getting pregnant in an IVF procedure. And most of these studies really indicate that the absence of this dysbiotic pro-inflammatory microbiome, so the presence of a pro-inflammatory dysbiotic microbiome reduces your chances to get pregnant. On the contrary, if you are dominated by lactobacilli, those chances are higher. So we have also recently replicated a study like this in a collaboration with a large clinic in Boston called Boston IVF. And there we also recruited 300 women, measured their microbiome, measured their inflammatory status by really looking at inflammatory markers in the cervical vaginal secretions, and then correlating that to pregnancy outcomes. So that study is not completely finished yet, but we already have strong indications that also in that large cohort, these findings published in various papers from around the world are replicated. So there is really a strong correlation here. And I will say that the other area that immediately pops up if you are interested in this area is that the risk of a preterm birth is also very strongly correlated again to the dysbiotic microbiome, the pro-inflammatory condition, and is reduced if you are lactobacillus dominated. So those are the 2 indications that immediately pop up. I do also think, and we have to realize this area is still poorly studied, right? So preterm birth, yes, there's some data. In pregnancy, getting pregnant, there are some data. But other women's health indications like endometriosis and even gynecological cancers are increasingly or also correlated to the microbiome. And again, dysbiosis, inflammation seems to be putting you at higher risk. So that I think is sort of the landscape of knowledge that we have now. Now, still, there are very few data about actually intervening on the microbiome composition and how that then will change clinical outcomes. And maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit further in our conversation if that would be of interest.
That would be great. Yes. Can you go into detail on these potential interventions?
Yeah. So, as I said before, I am a microbiome scientist, and the science that mostly advanced, I think, our understanding on the role of the gut microbiome in health and disease comes from what is called fecal microbial transplants, right? Because here you actually, in a person that has a disease context, you do an intervention where you put a complete microbiome into that person and then see how the clinical outcome changes. So we have translated that to the vaginal microbiome. And essentially what we've done is we have screened women. We started with healthy women that had no symptoms and not in any indication. And we screened women that had a well-stable lactobacillus-dominated microbiome. And we did a whole range of safety characterizations as well. And then we harvested, for lack of a better word, these cervical vaginal secretions from women. And we stored them and froze them and then made them available for a clinical intervention study in a vaginal microbiome transplant. And I do want to emphasize, I will not talk too much about it, but in order to be able to do this, you have to do an extensive safety characterization, both on the donor and on the sample, so that it's absolutely safe to use this material in an intervention study. So the next thing we did is we then kept on screening a population, and we also identified women that were dysbiotic. And in our case, these were healthy women. They did not have any symptoms, but that had this adverse microbiome, this dysbiotic pro-inflammatory microbiome. And then we dosed these women on 3 consecutive days with this lactobacillus-dominated microbiome from those donors that I talked about before. And we followed what happened with the microbiome in the recipient. And lo and behold, announced the top-line results of this study a couple of months ago, but lo and behold, in about 50% of the cases, we actually see colonization of the bacteria from the donor in that specific recipient. And we see a resolution of dysbiosis. And very typical about the vaginal microbiome is that it's almost like a binary state, right? Either you are really properly colonized and those new bacteria completely take over, they become dominant 90-95%, or it doesn't work, which is very interesting from a therapeutic point of view, but it really helps you in your drug development program. So that's the first studies that we did. And I do want to say one thing. I talked a couple of times about measuring inflammatory markers also in cervical vaginal secretions. So we have some preliminary evidence, but quite convincing, that actually if you change the microbiome in women that are dysbiotic and are in a pro-inflammatory state before the intervention, if you then change the microbiome, actually, if you get lactobacillus dominance, those inflammatory markers sort of track the change of the microbiome and they disappear. So this is I think the first line of evidence that the microbiome is driving inflammation. It's not just a cause of inflammation, it's actually part of the cause of the inflammation, which really puts us in a very strong position to build on this going forward.
I'm talking about building on. Are you able to go into a little bit of detail about Freya's reproductive immunotherapies?
So our microbial interventions, we call them microbial immunotherapies because they are microbial, but they're at the same time also a immunotherapy. And we essentially have 2 product modalities now at hand. One is essentially the vaginal microbiome transplant that I just described, right? We have developed a process, and we know that it's possible to scale this in a production fashion, for lack of a better word, that can actually be, so that it can be used as a therapeutic. And I do want to go back for the gut microbiome space. There's actually 2 products on the market now that are essentially fecal microbial transplants, right? So we could do this also for our vaginal microbial transplants. But we've also done something else, because our deep analysis on the microbes in the donor sample by sequencing, essentially you look at DNA and you can then very precisely describe which bacteria or species are in there, but even which strains are in there. And by also doing that on the recipients that were and grafted by this donor material, we were able to identify the strains that are best possible, capable of engrafting in that recipient. And we've done that in a number of women. And then we see specific patterns. Some strains are better capable of colonizing than others. And with that information, we went back to those donor samples. We actually pulled out the bacteria physically in the lab, right? So we grew them on plates, and we then made stocks in our freezers. And with the combined data of our discovery platform with this vaginal microbiome transplants, we were able to identify the best combination of strains to put in a defined consortium, right? So a small number of strains that are in a combination form our second product. We call this FB301. And the beauty of these defined products are that this is actually totally scalable. And of course, you can imagine it's from a safety perspective way safer, because there's no donor material, no viruses that can come from a donor, because you really have a purified bacterial consortium. And you can manufacture this over and over again, right? So for eternity, we can produce exactly the same product going forward. So that's the second product that we are working on. And at this stage, with the 38 million that you referred to earlier on, we are actually financed to take our product to a phase 1 trial, which is, again, looking at safety. But we can even do a phase 2 trial in an IVF population, where we hope to be able to demonstrate active colonization and then also an effect on pregnancy outcomes.
Brilliant. Okay, so looking towards that future and beyond, in your opinion, what's the future of the vaginal microbiome in life sciences, and what hopes will that future have for women's reproductive health going forward, looking at all the statistics explored earlier in this conversation?
Yeah, our expectation is, because of the central role of inflammation in many women's health diseases, and the central role that the vaginal microbiome plays in driving inflammation and immune function, is that we will see, and not only through Freya, just through the whole research community, we will see more and more evidence of the microbiome being let's say, call it a therapeutic intervention target, right? By targeting the microbiome and immune function, you actually have the potential to have a drug-like improvement of disease outcomes. And that is, frankly, I think, only at its beginning, because the amount of studies out there is just so much smaller than we've seen in other areas of the microbiome, that there has to be a lot of progress here. And again, about a half a year ago, there was an amazing paper on the role of the vaginal microbiome in treatment outcomes in cervical cancer, right? So I'm not sure whether this will be the next big therapeutic breakthrough, but it just shows the excitement that should be out there. Now, there's another angle to this as well, because I think the types of studies that I just described, these intervention studies where you track microbial changes, immune changes, and then potentially also therapeutic outcomes, is also a wonderful way to identify the role of specific immune pathways in disease outcomes. And that may even lead to, identifying other modalities that also address these specific immune targets. So I truly see the vaginal microbiome only increasing in importance. There's a growing research community and an investment community that wants to explore and leverage this. So in that sense, I think the future is really bright. And ultimately, most importantly, there's real opportunities to address those needs of women globally that are left untreated so often, and to really close this gap.
Close the gap indeed. Thank you, Johan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful speaking to you.
And so that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find out more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments of the series, at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podbean, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Twitter, or X nowadays, at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.